Okay, let's unpack this. We are doing a deep dive today into a topic that just relentlessly frustrates every organization that's trying to scale. How to overcome the predictable obstacles in leadership multiplication.
It really is. It's the pain point that everyone recognizes, but very few people address proactively.
Yeah.
If you've ever been in a growing company or any organization really, where ideas feel stifled,
Hmm.
where the senior leadership is just exhausted and where the emerging talent is sort of waiting for permission instead of just moving with initiative,
Yeah.
you're feeling the classic organizational bottleneck.
Exactly. And the research we've synthesized has a name for this. They call it hitting an invisible wall. And the crucial insight here, the thing that's so surprising, is that this wall is almost never caused by a shortage of talent.
Right, or market opportunities, or even money. The things you'd think.
Not at all.
So if the problem isn't resources or competence, what is it? I mean, the provocative truth the material reveals is that the difference between a high-performing leadership pipeline and a struggling one, well, it has very little to do with managerial structure.
Okay.
It has everything to do with these quiet, often unspoken internal dynamics. We're talking about things like personal fear, competitive pride, and these really profound generational misunderstandings.
So our mission today is pretty ambitious. We need to translate these internal and systemic barriers from, these abstract problems into practical, recognizable challenges. We want to expose these silent assassins so they stop being roadblocks and start acting as catalysts for intentional, repeatable growth.
And to start, we really have to look inward. The material frames this challenge so powerfully. It suggests that developing leaders is less a management decision and more of a psychological battleground.
A psychological battleground. I like that.
Yeah. The greatest barrier isn't the system or the team, it's the leader's own heart and, well, their own psychology.
That reframing is absolutely essential. It argues that the most destructive internal force is personal fear, which usually hides in plain sight. It's often dressed up as, prudence or strategic caution.
hmm
And the research identifies four specific forms this fear takes in high-capacity leaders.
The first one, and maybe the most toxic, is the fear of being replaced. We'll call this the irreplaceability trap. Historically, you see this when successful founders or long-term leaders start viewing the rise of high-potential talent not as a blessing, but as a direct threat to their status.
Right.
The core anxiety is tied to this lie. My value to this organization is dependent on my total indispensability.
And what are the organizational consequences of that? I mean, that kind of anxiety has to have a ripple effect.
A huge one. A leader consumed by this irreplaceability trap, they tend to starve their successors of meaningful opportunities. They make sure the emerging talent never quite develops the complete skill set needed to take over.
Which, of course, just justifies the senior leader's presence even longer. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy of stagnation.
Precisely. The second fear is the fear of inadequacy, which often aligns with the classic imposter syndrome. Leaders delay mentoring or delegating because they feel they lack the perfect clarity, the ideal framework, or the complete set of skills themselves.
They're waiting.
They wait for a perfect season to start developing others, and that perfect season, it just never arrives.
But hold on, doesn't competence matter? If I'm training someone in financial strategy, I actually need to know financial strategy.
Of course. Of
Yeah.
course competence matters. But the key distinction the research makes is that perfection is the enemy of multiplication. The leaders who successfully mentor others, they realize they don't have to be perfect. They just have to be willing to start. They model vulnerability and learning right alongside their mentee.
So the antidote is starting with what you have.
Yes, it's about depending on the organizational system and others, rather than waiting for your own personal perfection.
That's a massive shift in mindset, moving from competence as a prerequisite to dependence and shared learning as the foundation. Okay, what's number three?
Third is the ubiquitous fear of losing control. This one is rampant among high-capacity leaders, the ones who have achieved success through personal drive and really high standards.
Hmm.
This fear, it manifests as pervasive micromanagement and a chronic reluctance to delegate anything truly meaningful. They'll delegate the low-stakes or menial tasks, but not the important stuff.
I see this constantly. They delegate activity, but they never delegate authority.
That's it exactly. Control feels incredibly safe, especially when the stakes are high. But multiplication, by its very nature, involves high risk. You are trusting outcomes you can't entirely determine or manage. You're distributing power. And for a control-focused leader, that is terrifying.
And finally, the fourth fear, the fear of another's failure. That anxiety that your successors will fundamentally mess up, the vision or the process you worked so hard to build.
This fear completely overlooks a foundational truth of human development. People learn best through supervised failure. The most potent counter-narrative the material offers comes from these historical case studies of organizational scaling. Even the most successful founders and leaders, they often entrusted their entire legacy to imperfect successors who made significant repeated errors.
So it's not about finding flawless people.
Not at all. Successful scaling is the art of forming faithful or committed leaders, not flawless ones.
Moving beyond fear, the sources also highlight the pride barrier. This ego-driven possessiveness, it often hides beneath admirable language like protecting excellence or ensuring fidelity to the mission.
Yeah, that's a clever disguise for it. Pride convinces the leader that the entire success rests on their shoulders alone, and this transforms healthy stewardship into a really unhealthy ownership.
And the historical contrast is so stark. You have leaders who cling to power and watch their success fade, versus leaders who willingly subordinate their ego to the organizational mission. You see this principle so clearly with figures who intentionally step back as their successors rose, declaring, "The mission must increase, I must decrease."
That shift right there, that is the definition of mission-centric subordination.
That is the essential heart shift for a leader to embrace true multiplication. And this leads right into the final internal hurdle, insecurity. This one manifests as that poisonous whisper, "Will they outshine me?"
And this taps into a really destructive organizational dynamic, what you could call a zero-sum mentality. If an insecure leader views the success of a peer or a subordinate as like a finite resource, they'll conflate that person's promotion or achievement with a direct threat to their own status.
So instead of celebrating that potential,
They subtly suppress it. They turn their peers into competitors rather than collaborators.
so let's shift our perspective now and look at the larger organizational architecture. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the most successful, durable organizations throughout history, they've advanced not through mere addition, just hiring more staff, but through exponential multiplication. And that's driven by consistent generational handoffs. This isn't just a strategy, it's a necessary law of scale.
We can trace this blueprint back thousands of years. Consider the historical case study of Moses and Joshua. Moses' ultimate organizational greatness wasn't just in executing that massive shift out of Egypt, it was in preparing Joshua to lead the entry into the next, more complex phase, a phase Moses himself was unable to complete.
So the transfer of leadership becomes an act of strategic obedience to the mission. It's not an act of personal preference or convenience. It just happens when it's needed for the overall health of the system.
Exactly. And then you have the dramatic example of Elijah and Elisha. This was not a gentle transition. Elisha's commitment was radical. He symbolically severed his ties to his previous life. He burned his tools, he sacrificed his resources, all to commit to the mentorship.
Wow.
And the fact that the successor, Elisha, was empowered to perform a double portion of work, it just shows that multiplication is fundamentally about equipping the next generation to surpass the current one. It's not cloning, it's upgrading.
That's a crucial distinction. We shouldn't be training our successors to be carbon copies of ourselves. We should be training them to leverage our foundation and then exceed it. And the most explicit blueprint for scaling organizational impact comes from Paul's strategic vision, often called the four-generation vision, laid out for his successor, Timothy.
That one sentence is a masterclass in long-term strategy. It outlines a chain reaction of development. What you have heard from me, that's generation 1. Entrust to faithful people, generation 2. Timothy, who will teach others also, generation 3. Who will then teach others, generation 4.
So a four-generation discipleship architecture.
In one sentence.
Yeah.
Designed for exponential, sustainable scaling.
That model forces leaders to think way beyond their immediate tenure. Okay, so we've navigated the war in the leader's heart. Now, let's zoom out to the obstacles outside the leader, the organizational and cultural systems that actively resist the multiplication model, even when the leader's heart is right.
So many leaders focus solely on their team members' competency when the real barrier is the antiquated system itself. Look at another powerful historical case study, Exodus 18. Moses was the centralized authority. He handled every single judicial and administrative decision.
Right.
This created classic organizational strain. Bottlenecks, leader fatigue, massive inefficiency. The problem wasn't Moses' competence. It was the centralized system.
And the solution, which came from his father-in-law Jethro, was immediate decentralization. Appoint capable leaders of tens, 50s, hundreds, and thousands to share the load. It was a complete organizational redesign.
Exactly. based on distributing authority, not just distributing tasks. And we see this systemic maturity again in the case study of Act 6. You have this internal strain, a failure in service delivery to a specific group, and it forced the senior leadership to address the systemic barrier
Ow.
by creating a completely new tier of specialized, highly capable leadership. They intentionally redesigned the system to free up the core leaders to focus on the core mission, while empowering this new team to handle the service delivery functions.
This raises a vital question for any modern organization then. Are your current structures aligned for multiplication, or are they built for command and control? Because many organizational cultures suffer from what the sources call the indispensability myth.
Oh, the indispensability myth is lethal.
Yeah.
It's the belief, often unintentionally cultivated by senior leadership, that a few key personalities are structurally irreplaceable. This culture just kills initiative among emerging talent. They quickly realize that showing too much potential might threaten the status quo, but it won't earn them real authority.
So it perpetuates dependency.
It does. And it ultimately dooms the enterprise to decline when that one indispensable personality finally leaves.
And we can't analyze external barriers without acknowledging the dynamics of the generational divide. I mean, in today's landscape, successful cross-generational mentorship is non-negotiable. And that requires understanding fundamentally different value systems.
Yeah, the research highlights a really clear contrast. The older generations, the ones who built the institutional scaffolding, they tend to prioritize stability, hierarchy, and loyalty to the institution itself. They value process and proven methods.
While the younger generations, millennials and Gen Z, they're entering the workforce prioritizing purpose-driven work, radical transparency, collaboration, and they frequently question institutional authority.
Right. They thrive on experiential learning and immediate, actionable feedback. A mentor who fails to recognize these differences will lead to conversations that just fall completely flat. If you try to lead a purpose-driven, experience-seeking, emerging leader using only a hierarchy and stability framework, you will quickly lose their engagement and their loyalty.
So successful multiplication requires contextual adaptation.
It absolutely does.
So if we accept that multiplication is a function of conquering both the internal psychological barriers and the external systemic ones, how do we move from passive recognition to active anticipation? What are the tools?
We have to move from reacting to crises to actively anticipating challenges. The material recommends a proactive tool called the Barrier Mitigation Plan, or BMP. This is a structured approach where leaders proactively audit and navigate potential challenges across 3 domains: internal, your own fears and pride; relational, so mentee commitment, conflict; and systemic organizational structure, culture.
So instead of just having the fear of being replaced, you would list it in your internal audit, analyze its potential impact on delegation, and then develop a mitigation strategy, like delegate 2 high-stakes but non-critical tasks this quarter and commit to 0 interference.
Precisely. It turns the psychological hazard into a managed risk. And what's more, the real core of mentorship happens in these challenging interactions, what we call high-stakes coaching conversations. These moments of correction or confrontation are critical for accelerating growth, but they have to be handled carefully.
Right. The moment you correct someone is the moment you risk fracturing trust, which can undo months of development. So how does the coaching framework ensure restoration instead of resentment?
The framework is built on relational integrity. It must be aimed at sharpening the leader. As the historical principle says, iron sharpens iron. But it has to be delivered with the goal of restoration and preserving the dignity of the person.
So what does that look like practically?
Practically, these conversations have to rigidly follow a structure that integrates 3 things. First, affirmation of the leader's value. Second, a fact-based observational critique of the issue, avoiding judgment. And third, an invitation to dialogue to collaboratively define the next steps. The focus is always on strengthening the future, not shaming the past.
This deep dive has really laid bare the 2 simultaneous battlefronts for scale, the internal psychological work and the external systemic redesign. The urgency of multiplication couldn't be clearer in today's rapid environment of cultural and organizational flux.
The final synthesis is this. Leaders who succeed in scaling their impact are simply those who have learned how to navigate the psychological and structural barriers that others overlook. When you conquer the fear of being surpassed, you finally transform leadership development from a strained, forced task into a natural, self-sustaining, repeatable rhythm.
And This brings us to the final provocative thought for you, the listener. Based on this deep-seated wisdom on legacy, what kind of leader do you want to be defined by? The material makes it crystal clear. Your leadership is not finished when you lead well. Your leadership is complete when you multiply well. So consider this. What structure, what system, or what deeply personal psychological fear, that irreplaceability trap, that zero-sum mentality, are you going to intentionally surrender this week to ensure your organizational impact continues long after your tenure concludes? That's the true measure of success.